They had trudged along the road for many days. Bavaria was to be the dream. There, in a town surrounded by mountains, they were to be part of a fortress that was to store the most fanatical who would enact a heavy revenge upon the enemy and bring about glory and fame for Germany once again. But Bavaria was just a dream. The roads they walked were littered with all those who were searching for their place to be. The soldiers in tattered uniforms wandering towards camps that the enemy had ordered them to present themselves to. The people who, belongings pulled along in carts, who had fled the East and the horrors of the Soviets. Roads were blocked with the abandoned machines that had waged war that once had advanced with great speed into Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, but had ended up destroyed on German soil. Despite what should have been chaos, those that wandered maintained order. Soldiers still marched. The citizens moved in lines. It had been 12 days since they had the luxury of traveling in a car. But since the 10th, the columns of refugees, the roads bombed months prior from the air, and the lack of fuel meant the car had to be abandoned at the Elbe. Then, they joined the procession of the defeated. The spring days were warm and the uniforms uncomfortable. They were not the well-tailored uniforms of personal design that they were used to. Rather, they were the worn-out uniforms of some Geheimfeldpolizei that they had managed to procure. Missing the comforts of their lavish lifestyles, the lines and creases of faces once pampered were emphasized by the dirt and grime of what had become of their existence. For one, the one who wore the sergeant's uniform, rising in rank above his two colleagues in private attire, the one whose documents labeled him as Heinrich Hitzinger, it was the eye patch that caused most issue. It rubbed against his skin, and his depth perception was off. Nevertheless, the three wandered. It was outside Bremerforde that things started to go wrong. First, the Geheimfeldpolizei had been placed upon the blacklist of the Allies. It meant that if they were to come across an Allied patrol or road blockade, they were to be placed under immediate suspicion. Second, all ranks from sergeant and upwards were to be interred. The British were already marking out their zone, especially since the Flensburg government under Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz was still trying to operate a pseudo-government within their zone of control. This pseudo-government that had formally surrendered on the 7th and again on the 8th still operated as an intermediary, but it also, in its short life, had attracted many of the leading lights of the Nazi government that had managed to flee Berlin, and now with Germany's surrender, they were desperately trying to hide themselves and were trickling down through the zone. Thus, patrols and roadblocks were everywhere. Approaching cautiously, their guns at the ready, the British soldiers approached the three men, led by Heinrich Hitzinger. Wandering along the road, the three men had seemed almost surprised by the roadblock, but they were even more surprised when the soldiers detained them against their protests that they were just lowly soldiers. Patting their pockets and pulling any papers inside from within, the British soldiers scanned and placed dubious eyes on the three stragglers. The two privates, were very calm, weary, and calm. They took the unceremonious search in their stride. The other, Hitzinger, the sergeant, did not. His features scowled, and although he did not argue, he shook with irritation. A quick peruse of the information told the British they had some people of interest. The letter stamps were all marked as Flensburg, and Flensburg had been labelled as a key interest. To a camp they were transported. Near Lüneburg, the camp served as an interrogation centre. The sergeant, initially separated due to his rank from his privates, arrived first, and only later were his colleagues reunited with him. Left alone, he was watched from afar. He was watched brooding, his irritation at his positioning visibly showing. In the camp, surrounded by barbed wire, he felt the indignation of being treated as normal. A month had passed since he was truly afforded the respect that he felt he deserved. A month prior, he was stood in the Reichschancellery on Vossstrasse in the battered city of Berlin, shaking hands and raising an arm to the Führer Adolf Hitler. Hitler, who had trembled before him, as he liked to believe, due to the power that he commanded, rather than the disease or of treatments for, that had overtaken the Führer. He had left Berlin that same evening and negotiated with Norbert Mazur, Swedish representative to the World Jewish Congress, over the release of women from Ravensbrück concentration camp. He was afforded a meeting with Count Bernadotte of Sweden to try and arrange a negotiation with Churchill or Eisenhower. He was powerful and deserved, he believed, to be treated in a way which reflected his position that he had once commanded, not his current situation. His ego had to be fed, so he shouted out. Heinrich Hitzinger called the soldiers of the conquerors forward and screamed that he was in fact the Reichsführer SS himself, Heinrich Himmler. His disguise had been good. Without his little glasses on his face, with the eye patch over his eye hiding his brow, he looked like any other German soldier, rather than the man who had controlled the police state of Nazi Germany. Every British soldier knew the name, so they reacted fast. Reporting to the camp commander, Captain Sylvester, they informed him they had a prisoner claiming to be the Reichsführer SS in their possession. Sylvester ordered the men be brought before him immediately. The man claiming to be Himmler walked in, his chin pushed forward, his weaselly eyes gazing down at Sylvester, who sat at his desk. He had an air of pomp. Standing before the army captain, the small, exhausted character who desperately tried to hold his stature within his posture, removed the eye patch from upon his face and reached into his pocket, placed upon his nose a pair of round spectacles, and a quiet voice said, Heinrich Himmler, ich bin der Reichsführer SS. If Himmler expected the soldiers of the British Army to immediately jump to attention, like his jackboot-wearing, black-clad SS officers had once done, he was to be sorely mistaken. He had been searched, and in his jacket pocket, 2 brass capsules were found. One contained a glass vial, the other empty. Presuming it was poison, Sylvester guessed the other was likely within his mouth. Sylvester had food, tea, and clean clothes brought in as they awaited the arrival of Chief of Intelligence Colonel Michael Murphy to arrive. Himmler ate and drank, but other than pulling on the fresh socks, underpants, and shirt provided for him, he refused to wear the British Army clothes. He was still full of his own importance. He, like Goering, believed he would still be necessary to stem the tide of the Soviets in Europe. When Murphy entered, Himmler's eyes changed. The pleasantries of Sylvester were over. A blanket was casually thrown onto him, and he was quickly bundled into a car. The language also changed. He was now on the receiving end of terms of phrase he had never heard, and he was beginning to feel threatened. They arrived at a new building, and he was marched inside. Someone was waiting. Sergeant Major Austin. He had been ordered to thoroughly search Himmler, and he ordered him to get undressed. Himmler looked perplexed and bemused. Here was a man standing before him, ordering him, the Reichsführer SS, to get undressed. He asked, "Do you know who I am?" Austin replied, "You're Himmler, get undressed." Himmler did as he was told. His ego was hurt, but he was no longer protected by his bodyguards, nor did he have the SS organization surrounding him. He was now Heinrich Himmler, former Reichsführer SS, and former chicken farmer. A doctor entered by the name of Wells and ordered Himmler to open his mouth. Wells could see something, but he had not enough light. Ordering Himmler to the window to search the cavities of Himmler's mouth, Himmler suddenly jerked his head, and the vial hidden within his mouth cracked between his teeth. Potassium cyanide spilled out, and with a defiant final look on his face, Himmler fell to the ground, dead. Himmler had commanded the most vile and evil organization in human history. Its members had commanded concentration and extermination camps, committed atrocities across Europe, slaughtered citizens, deported millions, and advocated the use of slave labor to further their own progress. But were they going to pay? Or was it to be that with the death of Himmler, the embodiment of the SS, a justice could have been said to be won? A justice that would neatly allow for the crimes of others to be negated.
Achtung, Achtung. Hier ist die Sendestelle Berlin im Voxhaus. Meine Damen und Herren,
They were all gathered, or at least around 450 of them were, in a building occupied and adapted by the American army, where the Winter Olympics had once been held in a time when Hitler's Germany was being admired by some politicians and nations, as the crimes already committed were pushed aside in favour of the spectacle laid before. Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a town that lays in southern Bavaria surrounded by picturesque mountains that lay capped in snow most of the year round, was and remains a quiet provincial town, where the great event of the year are the winter sports still held on the slopes of its peaks. Now, in 1945, with Hitler dead, his demise reported to the German nation that he had died in a final stand against the Bolshevik horde, did the Americans return to the town in which they had won 1 gold and 3 bronze medals 9 years before. Germany was in ruins, its cities and its history left smouldering as it began a new era, Anno Null, as the narrative of a nation must begin anew for the first country to fall victim to Hitler and his Nazis. For those that had won, the investigations began. The searches for those who had been at the top of the regime also began. Some, like Goering, had handed themselves in, believing that they would be necessary for rebuilding a new Germany after the war. Others, like Armaments Minister Speer, tried to continue a government with no country. With the discovery of the camps, hunts were held for the commandants. Otherwise, the great pillage was to begin. 4 nations desperately trying to claim those who had pushed the limits of technology and invention, and discarding their crimes, bring them into a fold that would procure not only technology, but the brains to push their own programs of war forward in the future. Werner von Braun, his brother Magnus, Walter Dornberger, all had handed themselves in to the Americans at the end of the war. They had been placed before the cameras and posed with soldiers for photographs, a mixture of grins and stern looks as the road before them seemed unclear, and now they were gathered along with many of the other scientists and workers who had been based once at the Peenemünde base and transported south on the SS Vengeance Express. The feeling of uncertainty amongst the scientists must have weighed heavily upon the conscience. What was to happen to them? They had been involved in a rocket program that had produced over 6,000 rockets alone that were targeted at Britain. Granted, many blew up long before they soared even over the English Channel or North Sea, but 2,340 hit London. But did the conscience weigh with the deaths of 20,000 people who had been degraded, denied food, and an existence that resembled that of a human? Did they ponder as they sat in their cells or ate the canteen food of those that had perished so that their weapons might be produced? Did they worry that they might have to answer for their crimes? It was a never-ending stream of interrogations. All the different levels of intelligence and nations' own versions wished to speak with them. Some posed the same questions. Others intrigued the scientists with questions over the programs within the Nazi state. Programs that had technology that might have been useful to the rocket scientists, that due to the internal conflicts of egos of the Nazi hierarchy, they had been unaware of. Question after question was posed. The armies wishing to know of the whereabouts of other members as scientists asked over their own families. Communications had broken down across Germany with the Allies' assault inward both east and west. Mittelbau-Dora had fallen on the 11th of April when the American armies had overrun the area around Nordhausen, as Erhard Brownie death-marched many of those who had survived away from the camps. There the Americans witnessed firsthand the death and destruction the Nazi regime and the rocket program had brought on human life, and in Nordhausen it was only amplified by the discovery of the buildings that had once been used to house those too sick to work, which were a ruinous mess of masonry and wood from a British RAF attack. On the 3rd and 4th of April, that had killed over 1,300 prisoners who had almost made it to liberation alive, but in which over 3,000 had died at the hands of the SS prior. On the 5th of May 1945, the Second Belarusian Front under the command of Konstantin Rokossovsky captured Uzdum. Major Anatoly Vavilov was charged with leading the advance on the Peenemünde rocket facilities, to which the Soviets had been aware of their existence, but had chosen to focus the final attack on Berlin in the hopes of capturing the Reichshauptstadt on May Day, and also in the hopes of denying a breakout by Montgomery and or Patton to capture the city first. Now, with Berlin captured, focus was drawn to the rocket facilities. Wernher von Braun had been a subject of Soviet intelligence since 1935, but either through the Stalinist purges of the intelligence of the Soviet Union or forgetfulness had fallen from the interest of the powers of the Soviet Union. Until 1944, when the Soviets began their rapid advance on the territory of the German Reich. However, upon the arrival of Anatoly Vavilov at the Peenemünde facility, all that lay before him was destruction. The British had, long after the decision to move construction underground, realized the danger of the V2 program after the rockets had begun falling on Britain, and decided to launch concentrated air raids on the facility. Then, in the Nero Decree, the scorched earth policy of Hitler that was to be, if fully carried out, Hitler's last torture of the German people, a decree that was intended to return Germany to the Dark Ages. In September 1944, Albert Speer, who claimed later that he had put an end to much of Hitler's scorched earth policy, met with Willy Liebel, head of the Central Ministry of Armaments. Willy Liebel, as mayor of Nuremberg, had been responsible for the deportation of the Jews from Nuremberg, through which 99% of those deported perished, met on the banks of the Wannsee, the large lake in West Berlin, and where in January 1942 Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, and representatives from the courts and ministries of Nazi Germany had met to discuss the Jewish question in regards to the evacuation to the east, the euphemism used to mean transportation to the extermination camps. It may even have been that Speer and Liebel met at the villa where the fate of Europe's Jews had been decided. Here, at this lazy meeting in the summer of 1944, Liebel informed Speer that a Hitler decree had gone out to all the ministries, a directive of scorched earth that must be ruthlessly carried out on German territory. Speer remembered.
Partly to save from eavesdroppers, we sprawled out on the guest house lawn. It was a sunny, late summer day. Sailboats moved slowly along the lake as Liebel drew the picture of what the Führer's latest edicts meant. No German was to inhabit territory occupied by the enemy. Those wretches who did remain would find themselves in a desert devoid of all amenities of civilization. Not only the industrial plants, and not only the gas, water, electrical works, and telephone exchanges were to be completely smashed. Everything, simply everything, essential to the maintenance of life would be destroyed. The ration card records, the files of marriage and resident registries, the records of bank accounts. In addition, food supplies were to be destroyed, farms burned down, and cattle killed. Not even those works of art that bombs had spared were to be preserved. Monuments, palaces, castles and churches, theatres and opera houses were also to be levelled. A few days earlier, at Hitler's command, an editorial had appeared in the Völkisches Beobachter, putting the surge of vandalism into rhetoric. Not a German stalk of wheat is to feed the enemy, not a German mouth to give him information, not a German hand to offer him help. He is to find every footbridge destroyed, every road blocked. Nothing but death, annihilation, and hatred will meet him.
For Anatoly Vavilov, it appeared, as least in this incident, Hitler's decree had been carried out. The German Volkssturm, the army made up of the old, infirm, young, and disabled, had made good progress in bringing down Germany's most advanced facility to little more than a mess of concrete, steel, and electrical cables. Over 75% was destroyed, and apparently it was so little that he was ordered to destroy the rest himself. 2 days later, trapped in an enclave south of Denmark, the second and final Führer of the German Reich, Großadmiral Karl Dönitz, surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The following day, the surrender was signed for the second time in Berlin, by the lapdog of Hitler, Keitel. A day later, under mysterious circumstances, SS Obergruppenführer Kammler ordered his car to stop as it drove the road between Pilsen and Prague. With the car stopped, Kammler exited the car and wandered into the nearby woods. When he failed to return, his adjutants wandered into the forest themselves and discovered the body of Kammler laying upon the earth, glass shards between his teeth, the remnants of a cyanide capsule. However, other reports say he died from a gunshot, and a report that came from Dornberger ends more fancifully, placing Kammler in Prague, standing off against the Soviet troops, firing his gun wildly at the approaching Soviets after running from a bunker, only to have his associate, SS Major Stark, shoot Kammler in the back of the head. Whilst the scientists were held, they remained committed to the hierarchy. Dornberger and von Braun were the principal spokespersons, with Dornberger commanding and von Braun, with his small understanding in the English language, doing the speaking. Whilst Dornberger and von Braun, along with the other scientists, were held and interrogated, the Americans elsewhere, under Major Robert Staver, were trying to understand as much as possible about the V-2 rocket program. In Mittelbau, the Americans had already taken much of the equipment and documents found away, as when it came to the dividing up of the German lands as spoils of war, it was understood that Thuringia would end in the hands of the Soviets by the 1st of June. A Colonel Holger N. Tolstoy, who in 1945 was chief of the United States Army Ordnance Technical Intelligence in Europe, and predominantly a key mind in naval mines, was ordered to save 100 rockets from the Mittelwerk facility. Using abandoned train cars and putting to work not only German train drivers, who were desperate for money and work as the economy of their country was eliminated, and former prisoners. Pieces of rockets were dragged from the tunnels and loaded in boxcars to meet the 100 rocket request. The future of the rockets was to be part of a major test in the New Mexico desert and assigned to General Electric to be carried out. The British did what they could to salvage what else was left. Using some 400 railcars and 70 Lancasters, they are able to bring over 250,000 different catalogued parts away from the Mittelwerk factory and back to Britain. The aim was to try and emulate the rocket launches carried out by the Germans as part of the beginning of a British rocketry program. In March of 1945, a Polish technician at Bonn University, the city that would become the capital of the future German state, found, stuffed within a toilet, some torn pieces of paper. This piece of paper, once assembled, would eventually find itself in the hands of MI6, who would share it with American intelligence. The paper contained a list. When the war had turned against Germany, and the need for new technologies that might, as the original plan had been for the rockets at Kummersdorf during the Weimar Republic, bring a status quo in power for Germany, or even give it the upper hand, was great. Werner Osenberg had drawn up a list of the scientists, engineers, and such that should be drawn away from the front lines and once again placed in fields that reflected their knowledge and intellect. For the Western Allies, it was a treasure trove of information. It negated the long and laborious process of gathering or having to extract information. From the Osenberg list, Major Staver formulated his own list. It was to be a list of all the principal scientists that the British and the Americans would wish to speak to, and for Major Staver, von Braun was number one. Staver, having arrived in Nordhausen and overseen the removal of the rocket equipment, began to wander the local area for other remnants of the rocket program, mainly the scientists who had been left behind. He found Karl Otto Fleischer, who had been an army manager in the rocket program, and also Walter Riedel, who was part of the top trio of Dornberger, von Braun, and Riedel, who had designed and debated much of the rocket's later development. Riedel was in poor shape. Having been held in protective custody, he had lost the majority of his teeth due to American soldiers interrogating him with their fists. But from Fleischer, Staver was to get the great prize. Over 14 tons of files had been extracted from Peenemünde when Kammler had ordered the scientists to relocate from the Baltic to the Harz. In the Harz, these vital pieces of information were stored within one of the many tunnels that dove deep into the mountains. It had meant that when the British had bombed, the Volkssturm had destroyed, and finally the Soviets had captured Peenemünde, they were left with nothing but ruins, and perhaps believing that the wealth of information that had been created over the years of the Army rocket program had been lost. However, somehow, Staver was able to extract from Fleischer, reportedly through trickery, in which mine, within a mountain, that all of the information of the German rocketry program that provided an invaluable step ahead in technology was stored. With the discovery of this information, the Americans sought to keep it to themselves, not even allowing their allies knowledge of its existence. They arranged for all 14 tons to be loaded onto trains and transported west with great haste, for it was rumored the British were preparing roadblocks into the sector and might, upon a search of the train, discover the information and America's betrayal. Slowly, in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, the rocket scientists in custody were categorized by their roles and beliefs in relation to the Third Reich. Arthur Rudolph, who had represented Peenemünde at Mittelwerk, was characterized as a die-hard Nazi. Others as fellow travelers. Von Braun as a German nationalist. But within weeks of being captured, von Braun's mind had already traveled back to the moon. He now was speaking with a nation that, from both World War I and World War II, had profited greatly from war. Its production of armaments had made it wealthy, and it was keen to continue launching his rockets. With the stars and stripes hanging before him, he began to wander once more far from Earth. On paper for the British, he began to lay down his plans for how the developments that Germany had made in rocket development as an instrument of war could be translated into future concepts. But they were concepts tailored not to his idealism of flying to the moon, as he had done with his test pilot, Erich Varsitz, who had piloted the HE-112, but rather with all the ideas tailored towards a use as weapons. If he presented an idea for a peaceful use, he made sure to counterpoint it with a use for war. He mentioned ideas of flying a great mirror into space that could be used to change Earth's weather or destroy nations, for rockets that could fly the Atlantic in 40 minutes with passengers on board, or be used to fly bombs. Von Braun was presenting himself as the man that would do anything for the nation that would give him the chance to play with rockets once more, whether it was for peace or for war. It was this willingness, this eagerness to appease who he potentially saw as his new masters that may have even begun the process of the Western Allies to extract from Germany the greatest minds and take them on the return journey to America. In June it was decided. The withdrawal and the handing over of Thuringia to the Soviets had been delayed from the 1st of June to the 21st. There was a window of opportunity where, with the help of von Braun and with the list Staver had drawn up from the Ausenberg list, reducing the number of scientists, mathematicians, and engineers from numbering within the many thousand down to just over 1,000, these scientists may just be procured. Von Braun was aroused one morning. It was a Sunday in June, and the summer was arriving. But a Sunday in southern Germany, even despite the war that had just raged for 6 years and recently come to a close, was still a Sunday, and the Catholic community that included most of the residents of Garmisch-Partenkirchen relaxed, in bed, or meandered their way to the churches. Von Braun was curtly told to gather some necessary clothes and toiletries that had been provided for him. Once ready, he was escorted from his room within the 3-story building and taken to a waiting jeep. Sat waiting for him, among some Germans, were 2 Americans. One was an engineer from General Electric, who had agreed with the Americans to take responsibility for the test firing of the 100 rockets in the New Mexico desert. The other American was Major Staver. Through the countryside the jeep drove. Fields were littered with the battered vehicles of the Wehrmacht that had since been abandoned, awaiting recovery and disposal by the occupying forces. There was peace in the countryside. Then came Munich. Munich city centre had been predominantly laid to waste, but it wasn't into the city that the men in the jeep were driving. It was rather to an airfield. At the airfield, a typical American transporter plane was awaiting the men, a DC-3, or in the military terminology, a C-47. As the men boarded the plane, the engines spooled up and burst into life. Smoke puffed from the pistons and the props spun up. the whine of the engines growing louder as the blades thumped at the air. Within moments, the plane, rickety, and with the only comfort being the box wooden bench that ran along both sides of the fuselage. Von Braun sat wondering where this sudden shift in the daily ritual of boredom, only sporadically interrupted by interrogations, which were often the only point of interest throughout the day. Life had changed much in the last few months. From feverishly working on rocket plans for a nation that now no longer existed, to being placed in fear for one's life as the scorched earth policy licked at the lives of those who had advanced German engineering and the future of rocketry and flight greatly, to hiding out in a mountain retreat, on to being in the custody of the Allies and still blinded by the dream of space. Now he, von Braun, was on a rickety plane which had no sound insulation, hurtling into the sky. He had been creating the weapons of the future with technology that was far advanced, and the war had been won by crude, simple, and mass-produced. Hitler and the Germans had been wrong all along. It wasn't about having the best. It was about having the most average and making sure that if one average was lost, there was at least one to replace it. Sat in the plane as it soared ever higher, von Braun gazed at Staver. Staver had with him a box full of cards. On each card there was a name, a profile, and a last known location. It had been meticulously prepared. For von Braun, Staver's box of cards meant survival. It meant that despite being chief scientist for a rocket program that, in the manufacturing of the rockets, had led to the death of some 20,000 people and had rained down on Western European cities, killing at least 5,000, the Americans were ready to look beyond, and that they were aware that with Germany defeated, Germany's old ally, then enemy, the Soviet Union, was quickly also going from ally to enemy of the West. It was now not just a race for knowledge, but a race for the very people who had created said knowledge. It meant with the vast wealth of the United States and the bringing together of the collective minds to work without masters who knew nothing of the science, but only knew of brutality, Werner von Braun might just get to live out that childhood dream that had stayed always with him. It wasn't a long flight. The plane was only flying from Munich in the south of Germany to Nordhausen, so it was not long into the afternoon that the plane touched down on a grassy airstrip. Waiting for them were a line of US Army trucks. Each had a handful of soldiers. Major Staver, along with adjutants, organized the trucks according to whom they were to search out and collect. Passing out the cards that he had so laboriously noted down the details of, the scientists who had not been transported by the SS on the Vengeance Express, but rather had been abandoned in the Harz and had distributed themselves amongst the hundreds of small towns and villages that were nestled within the landscape. For Major Staver, von Braun was to be a tool of persuasion, to bring the scientists cautiously but quickly out of hiding and into the trucks to be evacuated away from the area that was so shortly due to be placed in the hands of the Soviets. And any extra mind the Soviets captured meant a loss for the United States. Von Braun was keen to help. He still possessed his unrelenting charm and wit, and as a German it would be easier for other Germans to trust than the now occupiers of the land that to them was once known as Germany. The trucks set off, and into the afternoon they drove. First it was to visit Bad Sachse, where they had been placed by the SS after the abandonment of the Peenemünde facility. In Bad Sachse, von Braun was sent to knock on doors and windows and bring the scientists out if their name was on a card. But von Braun could not be everywhere at once. It was decided that only the top officials were for von Braun, and others would be collected by the trucks, the cars, or whatever else the US Army could make use of to mine the greatest minds in a matter of just a few days. Into the night, von Braun was driven around, rousing scientists from their slumber in the sleepy towns that, with the ending of the war, had gone back to their isolated nature. When the truck was full of scientists who, with their meager possessions packed in battered suitcases from which they had lived since the beginning of the Peenemünde facility, or from when they had been released from the army under the Ausenberg list, they were driven back to Nordhausen, offloaded, and then, like those who were stolen from their lives to work at the Mittelbau-Dora facility, loaded into passenger trains. Richard Porter of the General Electric watched, as the well-fed, well-dressed scientists were squeezed in. Then, with a release of the whistle, the train was to depart. It did not have to travel far. The scientists were not to be immediately transported to the United States. The initial goal was to collect as many scientists as possible and retrieve them from what was to become the Soviet sector. So this packed train plodded along the repaired rails in a Germany that no longer had to look to the skies as a source of danger, towards the town of Witzenhausen. Witzenhausen is a pretty little town, falling just into the modern state of Hesse. It lays less than 8 kilometers from what would become the border between the east and the west, where the Iron Curtain would eventually descend. Watched over by the ruins of the ancient Hanstein Castle, the town is filled with the half-timber framed houses and the Feldstein-constructed public buildings. In this pretty little town, whose great annual celebration is the crowning of the Cherry Queen, its only sign of damage of the Third Reich being the hole in the street where the synagogue used to stand. Once here, and collectively safe from the Soviets, the Americans could pick and choose which scientists they wished for and which they would release, knowing for the most part that the scientists would not venture back into Soviet territory for the fear of being taken to the vast wastes of the Soviet Union. However, von Braun could not rest. As soon as those gathered by himself were offloaded from the trucks, he was sent out once again. From the night into the early light of the new morn, the trucks drove, their headlights searching the narrow roads ahead. Knocks at doors revealed more scientists, and the journey to Nordhausen would be repeated. Further and further afield they travelled until they had as many as they could muster, and the tired, exhausted soldiers and scientists could slump and relax. Major Staver, however, did not relax. He was still missing something. He knew that much more information was still hidden away within the area around Bad Saxe, but with so many minds he was grateful for the information that Fleischer had inadvertently provided about which mine the German rocket program's documentation was stored within. On the morning of the 21st, the day the Soviets were due to arrive, Major Staver hurriedly dashed around the town searching for the mine, that in which the documents were buried. Aided by a metal detector that had been used to search for German mines, ones that might explode, but had proven useless against the Shoe Mine 42 that was constructed from wood, Major Staver scanned the ground where he had been informed that over 100 kilos of documents were stored. A sudden beep of the detector, and within moments his army-issue spade had dug into the ground to reveal the metal containers. Hurriedly, after a quick scan of the documents, the casings were loaded onto the jeep, and Major Staver put his foot flat to the floor to escape what would become the Soviet sector with information, invaluable to the future of warfare and the exploration of space, stowed on the back seat of his olive-green U.S. Army Jeep. If you were to wish for this to play out with the tension of a Hollywood movie, you would be forgiven. It should have played out as such, with Major Staver running a roadblock that Red Army soldiers had manned and making the narrowest of escapes. However, in reality, the Soviets did not arrive in Thuringia until the 1st of July. In Witzenhausen, the newly arrived scientists were distributed to buildings that could, although barely, accommodate them. The core group, including von Braun and Dornberger, were housed in the Coleman House, a former school and pension that stood just 2 stories tall. The Coleman House was never supposed to take 80 rocket scientists plus their families. Living conditions became tough, but nothing compared to the squalor in which those in Dora had to live. Beds which they had, unlike those initially in Dora, were pushed against the walls and along the corridors. A communal kitchen was established, and food was bartered for and purchased from local farmers. With great speed, however, the scientists fell back into their discussions and idealism of rocketry, in exploring the moon and the stars, with von Braun believing, with the success that they had had with the limited support and meddling of the Nazi German state, there was no greater scientists than the ones he had around him. Major Staver and the Americans, with von Braun's help, had managed to round up over 1,000 scientists, a considerable number. But the Americans were not the only ones in possession of German scientists. The Soviets had occupied Thuringia on the 1st of July, and by the 5th they were already attempting to produce rockets once more in the Mittelwerk factory of Mittelbau Dora. But the Americans had been successful in capturing the greatest mines, The factory, under Soviet command, was left with locals and the second tier, led by Helmut Gortrup, one of those who had been interned with von Braun by the Gestapo. However, the sifting of the scientists was to begin. Porter had approached von Braun with going to America and taking with him many of the scientists. For von Braun, desperate to continue his research and desperate not to end up in Soviet hands, he agreed readily, especially considering the good words his brother Sigismund had spoken about the United States. Porter and Staver asked him to put a list together of those he thought absolutely necessary to the continuation of the space program, and von Braun delivered a list of over 520 names. For Porter and Staver, at this moment 520 was too many. Porter assured von Braun that technicians and site specialists would be provided, but von Braun was adamant that there was no better person than a German for the roles. Slowly working together, Porter and Staver were able to bring down the number on von Braun's list. Each name he was crossing out seemed to hurt the charismatic von Braun. Finally, a number was produced: 350. 350 men to lay the foundations once again for adventures into space, whilst perfecting the technology for war pending approval. In the Soviet zone, the authorities were less than pleased that the Americans had managed to procure what they felt was their property. The German scientists were not people, but rather a commodity needed to pay for the crimes that Germany had committed across the Soviet Union. Americans, apart from the soldiers, had not suffered. The Soviets had. They knew the Americans would not keep the scientists in Germany, so using loudspeakers set up along the borders and shortwave radio broadcasts, they began to broadcast to the scientists in American possession. The approach was one of nationhood. If they wanted to stay in Germany, they needed to join the Soviet zone, where they were promised they could stay in their home country. Few of the scientists listened, but those who did so because of family or fear of traveling somewhere completely alien. But they should have known a promise from the Soviets was as good as a chocolate teapot. After months living in the cramped conditions, finally List 1 arrived, with 124 names on it. However, difficulties were found when the British requested the loan of some scientists to launch the rockets that they had assembled from the equipment scavenged at Mittelbau-Dora. But difficulties arose when Dornberger was sent over, and instead of being used as part of firing the rockets, he instead was sent to a prisoner of war camp, and then charged with the indiscriminate bombing of civilians in a war crime trial. Ironic, considering the destruction of Kassel, Dresden, Dusseldorf, Hamburg, and hundreds more German towns and cities destroyed by the RAF, rather than targeting factories. Someone must have pointed out this fact to them, and they dropped the charge of crimes against humanity for Dornberger. Eventually, the Americans would lease von Braun out to the British, if but for 1 week. After his return, and before the British even had a chance to launch a V-2, von Braun, along with a small team of other scientists, were loaded into trucks, taken for a medical examination, and then driven to the contrasting environment of Witzhausen to Versailles. It had been a long drive via Frankfurt, but now the scientists gorged themselves on finer food and they signed their 6-month contracts. Not that the Americans planned on letting them leave after 6 months. Rather, it was a way of convincing those who thought of returning to Germany that it was still a possibility. From Versailles, they were taken to Orly Airport near Paris, placed on a plane and flown via the Azores and Newfoundland to Boston, where they signed papers and were processed. It was also here that von Braun fell ill with hepatitis A, probably from the living conditions in Witzenhausen. However, it was only 3 weeks later that he would receive any treatment. As von Braun recovered, his colleagues were sent on, and then he himself was taken to Washington. In Washington, the captured German scientist was paraded through the Pentagon. Eyes followed him, the tall, blonde, broad-shouldered German, the former enemy. Was the German even a former enemy yet? Shown off before the American military personnel? Was he a prize? Von Braun was told he was to be sent south, in particular to El Paso and Fort Bliss. A never-long journey began, and as von Braun traveled south, so did his rockets. In thousands of pieces, in hundreds of boxcars, they were being transported across the United States to eventually be brought together with their maker. 4 weeks after having left Germany, von Braun arrived. Over the next months, more and more of the scientists that had been selected arrived as part of Operation Overcast in Fort Bliss. Von Braun was reunited with his brother and Walter Riedel, and ultimately Arthur Rudolph, the man who had overseen Mittelbau-Dora and had been part in creating the environment that stole the lives from so many people. It was clear now that the American military cared not about those who died, but rather they cared for becoming the number one military power. And these scientists, those who had been chosen to help push America forward, who had been selected from over 1,000 other scientists, pulled from Nordhausen and its surrounding area by the simple placing on the desired scientist's folder of a paperclip. In November 1945, Operation Overcast was renamed as Operation Paperclip.